Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk about the principle of designing for dignity, and this is something I've been working on. But first, I've got to lay the stage for you. Right now, probably for the first time in human history, we have a significant proportion of our population over a certain age. And for example, I think there's over 600 million people over the age of 65. It's around 9 or 10% of the world's population. In some countries like Japan, it's a quarter of the world's population, and it's only growing. So this is going to affect us all. I'm looking at it from a design perspective and my perspective, and how we can respond to this aging population and maybe have a better and more meaningful response, or I'm saying a more dignified response. So I'm going to talk about my journey. And my journey actually started with the elephant in the room. So what is that elephant in the room when you're designing for an aging population? And we'll all have to address it, and I'm still addressing it. And that elephant in the room is ageism. And it seems to be systematic across all societies, across all age groups too, and in all institutions. And it is skewing our response around how we can make meaningful changes and address the challenges that are ahead and the opportunities that are ahead. So I'm going to talk a little bit around my journey and also how design can start to make that journey. Now here's some interesting factoid about how ingrained this ageism is. We're all on Facebook. Well, Facebook has community standards around hate speech. And you cannot have hate speech, and rightly so, around different genders, different ethnic groups, religions, and they go down the list of all these isms, these prejudices. But they don't mention ageism and aging. And there was some research done about 3 years ago, and it was done in the gerontologist, a researcher out of the Yale, and she looked at these social online groups that were in Facebook that were built up around aging issues. And she found that almost all of them were about negative stereotypes about aging. The only one that wasn't was based around Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. She also found that 40% of those online groups were advocating for banning older people from public spaces. So it's a prejudice that is very ingrained and not really being talked about. And so what happens, and I won't talk about some of the other areas around ageism, but designers seem to be just as ageist as anybody else. And some of what's happening is there's not a lot of intergenerational contact. So in your life, you probably don't have a lot of day-to-day contact with someone at a certain age in sort of mundane things. And I think what happens as designers, we start to try to fill in the blanks. And this is what happens when we fill in the blanks. We get these products that have that whiff of a hospital about them. We also start to get these products, or as Gretchen Anderson, if you look at these types of products and what products say about people, they look kind of cranky, stupid, and kind of ugly. And I think that starts to be a reflection of that we think that the people are using. Now, I think this says a lot more about the designers and the manufacturers than it does about the people using them, and that's the problem. So in my journey, I'm trying to understand some of the issues, and I'll talk a little bit about where it sort of really hit me about ageism. A few years ago, I had developed an aging suit, and I also had my students in my class. I had a class called Design for Aging Population at NSCAD, and they also built some aging suits. What was interesting, these were suits you could put on that would simulate sort of restrictive motion about what it might like to feel about aging. So a little bit of an immersion tool. When they started doing it, it was a great exercise, but for the first time they did it, they brought in their suits, and when they were presenting them, one of the groups actually put on a mask. And you can actually buy Halloween masks of older people. And you know those masks, right? The crazy hair, the big eyebrows. You can actually buy Halloween masks about older people that you can pretend all these stereotypes. The other group actually must have gone to the far end of the thrift store and picked out the baggiest suit they could find. And they put that on, and I asked them, well, really, do you think people wear these at that age? And they go, well, it makes us feel more authentic. So what it did, it really cemented for me, the ageism is so ingrained in our society. And I felt bad because I thought I had sensitized them to the issues, and I felt I've got a lot of work to do. And that there is a lot of work to do in design. Now, the other thing is I developed my aging suit. And I had the same problem, and it got lots of publicity, and a producer flew up, he put it on for the day, and I restricted him with all of these things. And I said, how do you feel? And he goes, oh, I feel horrible. And what I had realized, I had just reinforced with the suit every negative stereotype about getting old. Hunched over, shuffling, in pain, all of the fear that we might have. So I really thought, okay, I need to address ageism in that, and it's really ingrained. So the question is, what are the aging suits that we are thinking that people are wearing? The next research I was doing was around product adaptation. And do people know who this is? Carl Fredrickson from the movie Up? Great movie. But let's look at two things about here. How they're presenting Carl. You know, of course everybody's wearing tweed suits, bow ties, pants really up high, kind of cranky look. So there's something interesting. This says more about the ageist attitudes and stereotypes that the designer was implanting, and then reinforcing these to all of us. The other thing for me is I'm looking at how people are hacking products to make them work better. And he's got the classic product hack, right? Things on the tennis balls on the bottom of his walker to make it, or cane to make it work better. So I was interested in that. And over the years, I had this fellowship at the Mayo Clinic, and I looked at product hacking. I went to people's homes, and I went online, and I collected about 400 of them. And I found a number of things. First, I found that a lot of seniors and older people are having to hack products because they're not being designed for them. They also, the hacks that were happening, if you're an institution, a lot of them these professional caregivers, were hacking them and making them more about function. They're kind of ugly, but they're functional. The people that were family members and the person that was getting older were hacking things to not just make them functional, to actually make them more dignified. And they're addressing dignity issues. And I thought that was really, really important. The next thing is, with this research, the Wall Street Journal said, oh, give us your 10 top hacks. And I kind of fell into the trap of giving these goofy things. But I did give them my top, and they wanted 10 hacks. I gave them my top one, the best one I thought. And you notice there's only 9 here? They didn't put my top one I thought was the best hack. And this is what they were doing. They were taking medication management systems and creating their own system to understand managing their medication. And I thought this was really interesting. The other ones were kind of goofy, right? They were kind of very visual, but this one was actually a critique of the system. So remember, when you get older, they blame you for non-compliance, they over-medicate you, and these people were trying to manage this system. And I thought this was really interesting, and I don't know why. I kind of asked them, and they said, well, it didn't really fit into our vision of what these product hacks might be. This was a really smart one, and what can we learn? And I think there was a lack of trust that we have about when people are trying to, from this age group, are trying to solve problems, we're not trusting their solutions, or not trusting what they're saying. So I think there's a number of factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I think when we design for an aging population, we're not really designing for the aging population, we're designing for frailty. And this is some work I did with Dr. Ken Rockwood in visualizing a frailty thing. And really what we're doing is we're only designing for the bottom, the real frail parts. So we're not dealing with the whole realistic aspect of an aging population of someone, let's say, over 65. We're only dealing with frailty. The other problem is because of this, the institution, the industry sector that, at least from a product designer, remember I'm a product designer, is all about the healthcare and medical. And the healthcare industry is one of the most ageist industries because look who they're dealing with. They're not dealing with the healthy older adult, they're dealing with the frail and sick. So that's their narrative, so that's a problem. The other problem is this then gets built into design categories where it's all about these assistive aids and monitoring and care facilities. Again, it's very specific. The other problem is then the focus for my design becomes all about functionality and control. So I think as designers, or everybody, we take shortcuts. And I'm going to talk a little bit of the design shortcuts. And we take shortcuts because we need to understand to move ahead in design, we have to do a little bit of stereotyping. The problem is when stereotyping gets ingrained and that it's not realistic anymore, that's a problem. Actually, in England, they had to take these signs down because they're not representative of an older population. Very stereotypical. So let's look at some of the shortcuts. We tend to focus on tech fixes over social fixes. Now, what do we really need? We need a wheelchair that we can have a conversation with someone. Because think about if you've pushed someone in a wheelchair, you're talking to their back of their head. but we get focused on technology solving everything. We tend to focus on functionality as opposed to beauty. I think we need to focus on both, and that's what we're not doing. We tend to focus on disability as opposed to ability. And I put this up here because this is a form of age, those two marginalized groups, right? But we react to one a little bit different. And they're both using, interesting, a lot of the words, elder speak and baby speak is pretty much the same thing, that exaggerated tone. He's got a walker. He's got a walker, but man, I want his walker. Look at the accessories, it's all about his ability. And so again, how can we have a better things? I think when we're designing, we're not really designing around empathy. A lot of times for the older people, it's pity. It's empathy for a younger person, but it's pity when we get older. So I think that's a bad place to start. Also, one's about we design around dependence and one around their independence. And I think we need to refocus things. So here's my refocus. If you take what was on the other side of what we traditionally round designing for an aging population, but refocus it more towards designing for dignity, one's a lot more positive, one's a lot more beneficial to society and to everybody, and also as a designer, it gets you asking different questions. So here's a new design lens that they say designers are good about empathy, and I would say maybe it's more, we don't understand empathy and pity, but let's add dignity to that. And that needs to be a design lens because it starts to ask different questions about what do people need, what do people want. And so I've been trying to design products around that, and I do fall into the trap of these assistive aid products, and you'll see. But it does start me to think about differently about what the needs and a framework for understanding dignity in terms of products. So a commode, and there's the old commode. And what would a new commode look like if you reframed it through all those different frameworks that I've talked about? And I think at the end of the day, we really need to start to have a more dignified response to designing for an aging population. I think we'll all benefit. So the last thing I'll leave you with is the idea, well, where can you start? Where do we start? All cultures have something called the golden rule. Every culture has it. It's the idea that one should treat others as that one would like others to treat oneself. So I think what it does at sort of a psychological level, it forces you to empathize with other people. Also, I think at a philosophical level, it gets you to think of your neighbor as I or self. And I think once you start doing that, you can have a much more dignified response, and I'm saying to my designers a much more dignified response, but I think everybody, we can have a much more dignified response where we can create a world where we all benefit. Thank you.